Greetings, class. In this installment, we're going to be addressing the question, how does the sociology of violence help us to understand conflict? And getting started, we're going to have to look at, well, what is the sociology of violence? And so sociology is the study of development, structure, and functioning of society. And so the sociology of violence is the study of the development, structure, and functioning of violence in society. Um, and so some of the examples here that we could think of just as how is violence socialized, we could think about some behaviors are okay sometimes, but then not okay in other contexts. Um, Somebody goes outside my window and starts fighting in my front yard, that's wrong. Two guys go into a boxing ring, have that same fight, then that's okay, right? We celebrate the sport of boxing. I mean, as a society, we accept it, we tolerate it, we enjoy it, we pay for it. Um, so we accept one version of the behavior, but outside of the parameters of a boxing ring where it's organized, um, if it's in my front yard when I haven't given permission, then it's not, right? So some cases violence is permissible and in other cases it's not. And so fundamentally what this question is talking about is how does an examination of the development, structure, and functioning of violence in our society help us to understand conflict? Um, The other part that's embedded here is that thinking about a sociology of violence and the socialization of violence um, looks at it as being a product, right? Violence is featured in our society as a product of the relationships between a number of variables. So it doesn't, it's not broken down straight to, what's our government, what's the state, what's the culture, what's our biology, right? But all of those features might have a role as part of the collective, right, in the understanding of how our society functions. So in our maximum level of violence, right, which would go well past, say, boxing, which for some people is an act of, say, entertainment, but that the act of fist fighting would be disruptive in a public setting without rules. At its maximum, we have war. Um, so if we're socialized, if our acceptance of violence permits um, the ideas and the mythology and the narrative that says uh, war is heroic, um, killing to defend ideology or values or religion or corporate interests, whatever, right? There's a lot of different justifications, right? And it's not just the United States of America, right? We see it throughout history. Um, in fact, one of our big challenges, right, in a 17-year engagement of conflict in Afghanistan, is this idea that was started under George W. Bush of kind of a good versus evil, but that's nowhere. I mean that's a thousands of years old story that we have ideas about, um, you know, fighting for gods and how that is a fight, a literal fight of good versus evil. And so when we think about it, right, if we look at conflict, again, not all conflict is war. Not all conflict is overt physical violence. Not all conflict is violent, even. Sometimes conflict is just a simple misunderstanding. But if what we see is a reflection of values, societal values, we very much can identify things like what are things that are prioritized, what are the things that are privileged, what are the things that are cared about. Um, but it also tells us things about our engagements and our willingness to pursue and protect and honor and defend, um, in a number of different ways. Right? What are the things you're willing to fight for? What are the things you're willing to die for? These are part of this kind of collective body that we would think about in a sociology of violence. So in the U.S., again, just as a good example, uh, we have these displays, right? Fourth of July is one. We celebrate freedom, um, and the idea that we would literally um, put our lives on the line and literally fight to defend our freedoms, right? It's an important part of thinking about the value of freedom in our society, right? And as a result of seeing that display, the annual tradition of celebrating freedom, we also have expectations to see, our regular intervals of protests as groups feel like their freedoms are being taken away. Um, Protest as patriotism would maybe be the nonviolent version um, of the violent revolutionary aspect of throwing uh, throwing over the oppressive or tyrannical regimes, right? And that's also a different part of our mythology, right? The United States come into being as the physical manifestation of rebellion against taxation without representation, right? Again, understanding the degree in which that value is incorporated into a display of our willingness to use, or even the desire to use. Right? Some people are very, very optimistic about their opportunities to physically and violently defend their freedoms, to showcase their support for a position that they're in agreement with, right? That would make one a hero, right? Um, so the legitimate use of violence in a society is part of the socialization of violence, right? Like I said, in its kind of culminating manifestation, we see war. What do we fight for? Literally, what do we kill for? Um, but in its other smaller forms, we see which occupations uh, have violence, which occupations have explicit declarations of violence versus permitted declarations of violence. Um, right? And so law enforcement agencies across the country maybe fall under this umbrella and in different ways. You can see what the representation of what it means to protect and serve through various forms of social media, um, our Hollywood versions of it and its movies, and television shows. Um, but even in the way that various law enforcement agencies and police departments advertise when they're looking for new employees, trying to recruit future officers. And the same also holds true for military service. Um, an ad campaign that has been popular is Be an Army of One. And a big part of that actually promotes being able to make a difference. Um, and it used to be like that the military would advertise and promote, like, join the army, see the world. But you rarely actually see the presentation so much as we'll train you to kill, and by the time you're done here, you'll have PTSD. Um, right? Again, that's a reflection of values. But so law enforcement officers, depending on which part of the narrative you follow, are maybe leaning more towards the protection than the serve, right? Um, Reality, however, on the whole, is that the average police officer never has to discharge their firearm in the line of duty during an entire career. But some areas that's probably far from being the case. And some officers have been involved in multiple shootings, and some officers have been involved in multiple fatal shootings. But so this comes from the part where our socialization in the U.S. is that we grant legitimate use of violent force to those who serve the law, and we accept their use of force under a number of conditions, including a belief that keeps the public safe, under the belief that they have been appropriately trained and have put themselves in positions to make the distinction that this is a last resort and this is what must be done in order to maximize public safety, and that violence against people who are doing wrong is justified, that their behaviors have been justified. Um, and so we see the debate play out in different ways, different jurisdictions, about things like when is it acceptable to use lethal force? Um, how bad do things have to be before, right? So one of the conditions might be that lethal force is permissible when there's an imminent danger to life, right, of the officer or other citizens. So that if somebody has robbed a bank and they're fleeing, if they're armed and there are other people in the premises, that looks like it could present a situation where the armed criminal could do harm. Um, but if somebody's robbed a bank and they're fleeing on foot and they're known to be unarmed and there are no other bystanders, shooting somebody in the back in some jurisdictions would then not be permissible, right? Again, this isn't a class so much on law, but the idea is that there are times and places in a society when violence is permissible. And the sociology of violence sets up some of the framework for thinking about that. Now, if we go from death, from lethal to damage, right, violence is doing harm, we still see the same thing. It just plays out differently in different locations, right? Moving from law enforcement to healthcare, a Hippocratic oath that doctors have is first do no harm. And so this is a reflection of, again, it reflects on our thinking about violence. And so there's debates about different treatments and whether or not those treatments do harm and whether or not our society wants to accept those treatments as doing harm or not, right? And this could be the difference between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide and various different, categorizations about how to let someone die with dignity, how to perform um, when the end of life care is failing or when somebody's condition deteriorates and they would prefer to expire before pain and suffering gets worse. And not all countries see this the same way, right? Um, so these are challenges, and they're challenges that we actually have conflicts about. Currently, there are debates about whether or not people should be more comfortable with death. People look at the financial impacts, right? There's studies that are done that talk about the significant expense in healthcare is actually spent on the last 30 days of an individual's life. So if we spent less on that last 30 days, then we would, by default have more money for either other things or on the part of their life that occurs before that. I think, actually, if I'm remembering correctly, it's something like 90% of healthcare on an individual is spent on their first 30 days and their last 30 days of life. But we want to keep our loved ones alive. And thinking about not providing care to people is actually a violent act. And I've talked about that at length, about watching people suffer. But if the state's looking at it from a question about what's their financial obligation to sustaining life, that the outcome is a little bit different than pay whatever it takes. And we see that increasingly, that the quality of care for the elderly or for veterans' homes and so forth has diminished, despite claims otherwise. The the larger trend line is negative. There might be moments and periods of improvement, but generally speaking, we don't want to pay as much, and we get what we pay for, and that is negative to those who are receiving that care, right? Um, and so some of that relates more towards the structural and cultural violence, right, than it does to the direct violence. Thinking back to Johann Galtung's example for structural violence is, for example, being able to have an illness that's easily treatable, but in some parts of the planet or some parts of this country, that could still be fatal because the quality of care or the access to care is missing. And then that would mean that something that should be treated actually is fatal, right? Death is violent. It hurts people. People suffer. Um, and that would be based almost for completely financial reasons in some cases. Um, in other cases, it would be much more like broadly structural. Um, but again, um, we see structural violence in healthcare. We could see cultural violence in healthcare. Um, Different societies look at different members of society in different ways, right? Do we value the young versus the old, the men versus the women? Do we treat the visitor as a better, right? Like I've been in Asian cultures where a guest is treated better than the native. Um, I've also been in places where if you're a foreigner, don't expect anything, right? Their obligation isn't to you, and uh, a person should maybe do some of that research before they travel. But again, access to care, considered as violence, right, is another way of framing that. But if we're looking at it as a culture says that we privilege certain things, then we treat people differently, and this justifies um, violence against individuals. So we can understand conflict more when we see it. If we see that violence is a way of validating one's place in a pecking order, then we see that, well, one, behaviors are unlikely to change when leadership changes because they will still end up doing the same things that the person that they've replaced done. Same behaviors, different leadership, fighting to get to the top, and then little changes. Um, but we also see that we're not going to change things by addressing it at the individual level. If you ask somebody in a culture where there's more overt acceptance for violent and aggressive behavior, if you ask the individual why they do it, or try to get them to change their behavior, it's not really changing the whole system. So if you know that the violence is more structural, then you have to deal with the structure and not the individual. If the violence is more cultural, like a culture of people who believe in certain types of behaviors, um, you're going to have to change the culture before you change the structure, before you change the individual. Um, Different example of that would be the way different countries on the planet see ice hockey. Um, some countries play more of a technical game, and they wouldn't have as much of the fist fighting and so forth. Other countries, they privilege and like enjoy the violent aspect of the game, and so when those countries come together in the National Hockey League, for example, the biggest hockey league on the planet, or the most lucrative, I should say, um, then the rules have to shift. And over time, for example, they've made efforts to make the National Hockey League less overtly violent. They've put extra penalties for violence. They've added different penalties, like the instigator penalty. If you start the fight, you can get in trouble for that. If it happens naturally, both people drop their gloves at the same time, then it's just matching penalties for the fight. But if you drop your gloves and try to get the other person to fight you, then that's not accepted, right? Because they don't want that as part of the sport, right? Why? Because they're trying to change the culture. Why? Because uh, they make more money when they make it a family sport, right? If if a guy and his buddy get to go to watch the game, and that's two people, because they're leaving the kids and so forth back home because they don't want to show them the fighting because they don't think that's good for them. Um, Hockey teams don't make as much money as if the two guys have their families and it turns into filling the whole suburban and going to the game or whatever. But it also impacts other things, right? Lots of head injuries from heads hitting the ice in hockey rinks in Canada. And uh, concussions, we're getting more information about how dangerous that is. So you don't want high school kids getting concussions because they're playing a more aggressive version of hockey. And so the culture changes. Information changes. Finding out about the negative consequences and impacts um, changes, right? But again, knowing the sociology of violence helps us to look at whether or not we're looking at individual behaviors versus structural situations versus cultural details. And sociology of violence can help with that. See you on the next one.